use a break from what's going on. I want to kind of cover two things. These videos aren't very structured, so I at least want to stick to points. Very first one being I basically just make these as a creative outlet for what's going on outside. Sure, we could all use a distraction. Very first thing I wanted to cover, barring its explanation, was what is going on outside? Why does it seem like we have kind of so many people with the inability to understand what's going on? Rather than give you my take on why that is, in this video explicitly, I'm just gonna link in the comment section or somewhere down there two videos as to what is really going on globally. And excuse my voice, I'm sick. But what's going on globally is, with respect, out of the average constituent's hands. It's not like he can do much about it. Don't get me wrong, this isn't to say that you shouldn't be expressing your, right to 1A or getting out there and talking about what's happening. We literally got nurses being slaughtered by a federally funded cartel. And we're being told something different. That's just the reality of the situation on the ground. Rather than going into why this environment was allowed to be created, of which, if you're able to look at the situation correctly, then you should be able to look at its history correctly. Which is to say, how did we get here? Why? And what are the events, that actually led up to it? So within the two videos that I'll link, there's going to be a very well-educated lady from Philadelphia talking to you about the global finance system. And basically what we're experiencing now is essentially a reset. All fiat currencies die. I can't tell you when the gold standard for money went away, but that was essentially the beginning of the historical end for the dollar. So it is what it is. All of that's, like I said, in the comment section or wherever I can link videos, and those ideas are going to be coming from people far more versed and intelligent in what is going on globally. But number two, what I would instead like to focus on is the creative portion of the things that I would like to control. And that is consciousness. That is kind of my thing in life. Like, I spend an exorbitant amount of time trying to understand what people's attention is on. And the reason I do that is because I believe that the idea of attention, what you can focus on, what you mentally can have the ability to be on, is explicitly a characteristic of consciousness, and I believe there is an equivalence relation with respect to that. Now, the reason I don't think that needs a formal definition, of which I've tried to do in the past, is because people have already done it. We just need to start looking at what they've given us and interpreting it correctly. Einstein's irreducibility criterion tells us that if things can fit into this general amalgamation of structure, it can't go down and be reduced anymore. That has consequences. But at the end of the day, if you did want to look up the irreducibility criterion, it's right here. The reason I put specific emphasis on this irreducibility criterion, especially with respect to attention, is because this allows us to start mapping what we can pay attention to one. And people who don't understand that function of mapping something one-to-one, let me instead kind of hold up the abstract algebra book that I studied in college, and point to chapter 1. Any good mathematical structure, any good explanation about the world around you is going to be able to be recompartmentalized through the mediums of, say, something that actually has structure and proof-based logic like math, and it's going to be able to be re-explained through that medium. Okay. Case in point, charts. How easy is it to graph, say, velocity on a chart? You know, a two-dimensional has an x and y axis. You can plot it out with a slope, velocity, right? But when it comes to consciousness, one of my favorite things to do is to simply equate our attention to rings. When we start thinking about how attention actually behaves, how it actually mathematically behaves, so think about how a sunflower is comprised. Fibonacci said this is the mathematical equation that comprises this spiral, if that makes sense. Now, without getting into the weeds of why that is a discovery, um, sorry, I lost myself, but bringing it back to circles and attention, we realize that rings are irreducible. They facilitate this irreducibility criterion. And two, they allow us to understand that attention is, how do I say, reflexive upon itself. When we say, and I'm just going to highlight this specific portion, I can't, but a sub n to times x to the n, when we are able to take things times themselves to the power of themselves, we are essentially describing behavior that can self-reference itself. Okay. So attention explicitly has the feature of not being able to pay attention to what it's not paying attention to. This is a fundamental feature of how logic works. So for instance, a cultural ring that I like to slam dunk my points with are that the jihadist Muslim is fundamentally different in terms of ring structure than, say, someone born in the Netherlands. Say someone who happens to be born in Antarctica, as some absurd example, or third world country like South Africa. Excuse me, most of Africa. Not all of Africa is third world. Did not mean to say that. But my point is to say is that where you are born dictates this cultural ring. You see what I'm saying? That's just not up for debate. This is just another example of how when we start paying attention to these rings, well, what aren't they paying attention to? So to use the jihadist Muslim example, are they really incorporating the doctrine of God into their life? Are they really living around, and let's just say we're a jihadist Muslim who's a diehard, you know, and I don't really know how to put this without being very upfront about what a lot of those. The last time I read with respect to jihadism, 4 out of the 5 countries that were ruled by Sharia law were the most dangerous in terms of safety to live in with respect to a woman. When it comes to paying attention, when it comes to what can they pay attention to behind, say, something like this, you have to understand that that person is coming and he's going to fundamentally come to a different set of conclusions based on this one cultural ring. Humans, in terms of consciousness, are layers of these rings stacked upon one another. This is the slam dunk. If you can view that everybody only has the ability to pay attention through one ring, then you've precisely defined how consciousness behaves. And it gets really cool from there. I think once we start divorcing ourselves from bubbly ideas like everything in the room is conscious, um, you're gonna have a lot. You're gonna have a more accurate representation of reality. The reason you think everything in the room is conscious is because those are quite literally manifestations of yourself. You've chosen to put these objects here. Of course you think they're conscious. But that's part of the delusion we need to get over. Just because you think that these things in the room have importance with respect to your consciousness doesn't mean that's what's actually going on. The very first thing we need to invite in is a one-to-one understanding of what's going on. So hopefully you guys can at least have the ability that I see is that we're kind of already solved mathematically with respect to attentions and humans and what's going on consciously. And I really do think it is extremely unfortunate that we have to sit here and just suffer through all kinds of language like, oh, I believe I have the answers for because of X, Y, and Z. Or consciousness cannot behave as such because it doesn't appeal to other bubbly emotional ideas that I valued throughout my life. So, for instance, it's not intelligent because it can't create music. It's not intelligent because it doesn't have the ability to empathize. And it's like, I can't think of how many examples we have had to go through throughout human history where we have had to rule out our own hubris. And I think once we are finally able to do that, the only thing that's left is the mathematics about what is going on. Once you've dissolved this whole, I need to have my ego with my name on it in terms of a theorem, you begin to realize, like, what are they talking about? So I think to kind of put this all back together at the end of the video, especially as a creative outlet, we have far too many ape-like creatures outside appealing to, let's just call it a set of rules they believe to be true. These people are no longer mammalian or reptilian in nature. So I don't know if you guys have caught any of my prior videos, but things that I cover are things like the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, how it is physically constructed, especially evolutionarily speaking. We are all comprised with a front-facing mammalian nerve and a back-facing reptilian nerve. And when you are able to produce a constituency that is no longer appealing to that ANS, what do I mean by that? When you are able to produce a constituency that is no longer thinking like a reptilian animal, that is no longer thinking like a mammalian animal, what is it doing? What do you describe it as? What do you call it as? Well, unfortunately, when you have a creature that is only appealing to a set of rules, you have an insect. And unfortunately, with respect to the insects that we're all experiencing, how do I put this as nonviolent as possible? If the infestation is inside of your walls, say for instance you're infested with termites, what do you do? Do you try to have a discourse with those termites like we are today with many of the ones shooting nurses in the back? Or, sorry, peaceful protest in my mind only goes so far. Um, and we've got to be able to understand what people's attentions are on, what people's attentions are not on, and we've got to be honest about what kind of behaviors we are observing. Because when we fail to do any of that, we have quite literally reconstructed what you're seeing today. Okay, so yeah, that's about it for my TED Talk. Truth matters. How do we get to truth? Some of you, it's not about going to college. It's really not. It's not about picking a left or a right ideology. It is simply being able to divorce yourself from this ego-driven state that you are in. And that unfortunately, most of the constituency of America is on the back side of this autonomic nervous system right now. We are, I gotta quit it. But yeah, good luck.